We'd been on the road for days, the three of us, me, Mia, and Kevin, chasing the freedom that came with a cross-country trip. The sun had been our companion, painting the Nevada desert in hues of gold as we cruised along Old Highway 50, the so-called loneliest road in America. We laughed, swapping stories and jokes, the miles slipping away beneath our tires. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, that lightheartedness began to fade. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the vast emptiness of the desert surrounding us. There was something unsettling about the way the shadows seemed to grow longer, the darkness creeping in like a living thing. I glanced at the gas gauge, noting how it dipped lower with each passing mile. Just as I was about to suggest finding a place to stop for the night, the car shuddered and sputtered. The engine died with a final, choking groan, leaving us stranded in the middle of nowhere. Mia looked at me, her eyes wide with worry. Kevin pulled out his phone, waving it around in a futile attempt to find a signal. Nothing. No service. No lights. Just the vast, empty desert swallowing us whole. As the darkness closed in, the weight of our isolation hit me like a punch to the gut. We were completely alone, miles from anywhere, with night settling in like a cold, unforgiving blanket. With nothing but the darkness around us, we decided to walk along the highway, hoping to find help or at least some sign of civilization. After what felt like hours, the faint glow of lights appeared in the distance, flickering through the desert night. As we got closer, we saw it. An old, run-down motel, perched just off the highway like a forgotten relic from another time. The place looked like it had been abandoned for years. The paint was peeling, the sign barely readable, and the weeds had claimed most of the parking lot. But the lights were on, casting an eerie glow over the dilapidated buildings. The door to the office was slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. Kevin hesitated, glancing at Mia and me with a look that mirrored my own unease. "This place gives me the creeps," he muttered. "I don't think we have a choice," I replied, the chill in the air seeping into my bones. We were cold, tired, and there was no way we'd survive the night out in the desert. Reluctantly, we pushed open the door and stepped inside. The interior was as worn as the outside, but there was something off about it, like the place had been frozen in time. The air felt thick, heavy with an unspoken history that made my skin crawl. Despite the unease gnawing at me, exhaustion won out. We decided to stay the night, figuring we could search for help in the morning. As we settled into our rooms, a sense of dread settled over me, but I pushed it aside, telling myself that everything would be fine once the sun came up. We were about to resign ourselves to a long, cold night in the car when Kevin spotted it. A faint glow in the distance, just off the highway. We trudged through the desert dust until it came into view. An old, run-down motel, seemingly forgotten by time. The building looked like it hadn't seen guests in decades, the sign missing letters, and the paint peeling off in large, uneven patches. But the lights were on, casting a dim, eerie glow over the cracked pavement. Even stranger, the door to the office was slightly ajar, creaking in the night breeze. Mia hesitated at the entrance, her unease mirroring my own. "Do you think anyone's still here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I replied, glancing at Kevin, who had already pushed the door open and stepped inside. Desperation overrode our fear. We had nowhere else to go. The night was growing colder, and the idea of spending it out in the desert was less appealing than the unsettling vibe of the motel. Reluctantly, we followed Kevin inside. The air inside the room was thick with the smell of mildew and dust, the remnants of a place long abandoned. We checked into the first room we found, each of us too tired and uneasy to protest. The beds creaked under our weight, and as soon as my head hit the pillow, exhaustion began to pull me under. But sleep wouldn't come. Instead, I lay there listening. The silence of the night was soon broken by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate, as if someone was pacing just outside our door. My heart raced, and I sat up, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped, replaced by the faint creaking of doors opening and closing, followed by the distant, almost imperceptible sound of a child crying. "Mia," I whispered, but she was already sitting up, her eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" She nodded, and then Kevin stirred, rubbing his eyes. "What's going on?" he mumbled, still half asleep. "There's someone out there," I said, barely able to keep the tremor out of my voice. Kevin tried to brush it off, saying it was probably just the wind or the old building settling, but I wasn't convinced. The sounds were too precise, too deliberate. The unease in the room thickened. Mia clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "I saw something," she whispered. "Outside the window, a shadow. I thought it was just a tree, but it moved." A cold shiver ran down my spine. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The noises, the shadow, the crying, it all felt too real, too malevolent. And the worst part was the feeling that had been growing inside me since we arrived. The sensation that we were being watched, studied, by something unseen and unfriendly. We were not alone in this motel. Something was here with us, something that didn't want us to leave. Unable to shake the dread tightening around my chest, I crept out of the room, hoping that walking around might calm my nerves. The hallway was empty, the motel eerily silent now, as if holding its breath. I wandered into the lobby, my eyes catching on a dusty old newspaper lying on the counter. Curiosity gnawed at me, so I picked it up, brushing off the thick layer of grime. The headline made my blood run cold. Asterisk, family vanishes from local motel. No trace found. Asterisk, the article, dated 30 years ago, detailed the chilling story of a family that had disappeared while staying here. The reporter mentioned strange noises, whispers in the night, and shadows seen where there should be none. Everything they described was happening to us. My heart pounded as I realized we were reliving their nightmare. Panic surged through me, but before I could process it, a blood-curdling scream tore through the silence. "Mia!" I bolted back to our room, throwing the door open. It was empty. Mia was gone. Her things were scattered on the bed, as if she had just been there. Frantically, I searched every corner, every shadow, but she had vanished without a trace. "Kevin!" I shouted, rushing down the hallway, but when I reached his room, it was the same, empty, desolate, as if they had never existed. I was alone. The motel had taken them, swallowed them into whatever darkness lingered here. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I was next. I could feel it, the oppressive, watching presence closing in, the motel's curse claiming me as its final victim. The Blue Ridge Parkway stretched out before us, a ribbon of asphalt winding through the lush, green mountains. Alex had his window down, the warm summer breeze tousling his hair as he snapped pictures of the rolling hills and endless blue sky. We'd been on the road for days, and the drive had been nothing short of perfect. Just the two of us, no deadlines, no worries. I've always been the cautious one, double-checking maps and planning our stops, while Alex was more of the free spirit, eager to embrace whatever adventure came our way. We were just rounding a bend when I spotted her. A young woman standing by the side of the road, her thumb out and a backpack slung over her shoulder. Alex noticed her too and nudged me. "Think we should pick her up?" he asked, already leaning forward to get a better look. I hesitated, glancing at the hitchhiker. She looked harmless enough, with a kind face and tired eyes. "I don't know," I said, my cautious side kicking in. "You never know with strangers." "Come on, Joe," Alex urged, always the more impulsive one. "She's just a hiker who got lost. We can give her a ride to the next town." After a brief debate, I relented. I pulled over, and she approached the car, her expression grateful. "Thanks so much," she said as she climbed into the back seat. "I've been walking for hours." She introduced herself as Laura, explaining that she'd lost her way on a trail and just needed a lift to the nearest town. She seemed normal, friendly even, and I felt a bit foolish for worrying. As we continued down the parkway, the three of us settled into a relaxed conversation. But something about Laura's presence nagged at the back of my mind, a feeling I couldn't quite shake. The road wound deeper into the mountains, and at first, everything seemed normal. Laura was chatty, asking us about our trip, where we were from, and where we were headed. But soon, I started to notice small, unsettling things. She mentioned details about us that we hadn't told her. How Alex had just graduated college, how I'd recently started a new job. At first, I brushed it off as coincidence, but the way she spoke made me uneasy, like she knew more than she should. Then there was the way she kept staring at Alex. It wasn't just casual glances. Her eyes would lock onto him with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Alex, oblivious as ever, didn't seem to notice, but I couldn't ignore the growing discomfort in the pit of my stomach. It got worse when she started muttering to herself. At first, the words were too soft to catch, but then I heard her clearly. "It's all going to end here," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "You can't escape what's coming." I shot a glance at her in the rearview mirror, and my blood ran cold. Her expression had changed. Her once friendly smile twisted into something darker, more sinister. The warmth in her eyes was gone, replaced by something cold and calculating. My pulse quickened, and I gripped the steering wheel tighter, suddenly wishing we had never picked her up. This wasn't just a lost hiker. We had let something else into the car, something that wasn't entirely human. The sun dipped below the horizon, and with it came an eerie, dense fog that swallowed the road ahead. What had been a clear, scenic drive turned into a disorienting nightmare. The GPS on my phone flickered, the signal cutting in and out, the screen jumping between roads that didn't make sense. I tried to stay calm, but the more I drove, the more it felt like we were going in circles, the same trees and curves in the road appearing over and over again. "Something's wrong," I muttered, mostly to myself, but Alex caught it. He looked at me, the worry in his eyes reflecting my own. I could see him start to feel the same unease I'd been trying to shake off since Laura got in the car. "Are we lost?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "I don't know," I admitted, tapping the GPS screen in frustration. "The GPS is freaking out. I can't tell where we are." Laura, who had been unnervingly quiet, suddenly let out a soft, almost mocking laugh. I glanced at her in the rearview mirror, and my breath caught in my throat. She was staring out the window with that same sinister smile, her eyes gleaming in the dim light. "Is something funny?" I asked, my voice coming out more sharply than I intended. She didn't answer, just kept that eerie smile plastered on her face, as if she was watching something only she could see. The tension in the car was suffocating. Alex shifted uncomfortably, finally picking up on just how wrong everything felt. I was about to suggest we turn back, if we even could, when Laura suddenly leaned forward, her voice low and commanding. "Stop the car," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "What? Why?" I asked, my heart pounding. "This is where I need to get off," she replied, her eyes locking onto mine in the mirror. There was something final in her words, something that made my blood run cold. She was no longer asking. She was demanding, and the way she said it, like she knew something terrible was about to happen, sent a wave of panic crashing over me. The fog thickened outside, pressing in on us, and the road ahead was nothing but a blur of shadows and mist. Every instinct screamed at me to keep driving, to get as far away from her as possible. But something in her gaze held me in place, a dark power that made it impossible to refuse. My hands shook as I reluctantly pulled the car over to the side of the road. The fog wrapped around us, thick and impenetrable, as if the world outside the car no longer existed. Laura leaned forward, her face eerily calm. "Thanks for the ride," she said, her voice carrying that strange, mocking tone that made my skin crawl. She opened the door and stepped out into the fog, her figure quickly swallowed by the mist. Alex and I sat in stunned silence, watching as she disappeared without so much as a backward glance. I wanted to call out, to demand an explanation, but the words stuck in my throat. A heavy, oppressive silence settled over us, leaving us too unnerved to move. Finally, I snapped out of it, my instincts screaming to get out of there. I hit the gas and we sped away, the fog slowly thinning as we drove. Eventually, we reached the next town, our nerves still raw from the encounter. We decided to report it to the local police, feeling a need to make sense of what had just happened. The officer listened, his expression unreadable. When we finished, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You said her name was Laura?" I nodded, dread coiling in my stomach. "She died in a car accident on that stretch of road about 10 years ago," he said quietly. "You're not the first to pick her up." The blood drained from my face as the truth hit me like a freight train. Alex and I exchanged looks of disbelief, the horror settling in. We had given a ride to a ghost who, if we had been less lucky, might have taken us with her into the fog.
The road stretched out before us, endless and dark, with nothing but the faint glow of our headlights cutting through the night. Sarah and I had been planning this trip for months, a spontaneous adventure from California to New Mexico. The thrill of the open road had us buzzing with excitement, windows down, music blasting as we sped through the deserted stretch of Route 66. But as the hours passed, the energy started to fade, replaced by a creeping sense of unease. The empty road felt more oppressive, the vastness of the desert pressing in on us. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw it, an old rusty car trailing behind us. It was distant, barely visible, but something about it caught my attention. "Hey, did you see that car?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Sarah glanced back, barely paying it any mind. "It's nothing," she said, laughing it off. "Probably just some other late-night traveler." But I couldn't shake the feeling. The car stayed with us, never getting closer, never falling back. Just there. A quiet, unsettling presence that sent a chill down my spine. We finally pulled into a gas station, the first one we'd seen in hours. The place looked like it hadn't seen a customer in years. Peeling paint, flickering neon sign, and a single rusty pump standing under a dim light. The air was thick with silence, the kind that made your skin crawl. Sarah jumped out, stretching her legs, while I hesitated, feeling an inexplicable sense of dread. As I filled the tank, an old man emerged from the shadows, his face lined with age and something else, something darker. His eyes fixed on me with a look that sent a shiver through my entire body. "You shouldn't be out here this late," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "Not on this road." I tried to laugh it off, but the way he said it made my stomach twist. "We're just passing through," I replied, forcing a smile. He leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing. "Beware of the silent passenger," he murmured, his words thick with warning. I froze, the gas pump clattering in my hand. But before I could ask what he meant, Sarah called out, ready to hit the road again. I nodded quickly, eager to leave. We both shrugged off his words as nothing more than an old man's ramblings. But as we drove away, his warning echoed in my mind, leaving me with a deep, unsettling fear I couldn't shake. We drove on, the desert swallowing us in darkness. The old man's warning still nagged at me, but Sarah seemed unfazed, lost in the music playing softly from the radio. The road was empty, the landscape a blur of shadows. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that rusty car again. But it was gone, vanished like it had never been there. Then the whisper started. At first, I thought it was just the wind sneaking in through a cracked window, but the sound was too distinct, too deliberate. I turned the radio off, straining to listen, and felt my heart skip a beat as the whispers continued, faint but unmistakable. Sarah noticed it too, her carefree demeanor fading as she looked around, confused. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Yeah. What the hell is that?" she replied, her eyes wide with fear. The air inside the car grew colder, a chill that seeped into my bones. I glanced in the rearview mirror again, and that's when I saw it. A shadow in the back seat, just out of the corner of my eye. I whipped my head around, but there was nothing there, just the empty seat and the growing darkness beyond the windows. "Sarah, I think there's someone in the car," I whispered, my throat tight with fear. She laughed nervously, trying to shake it off. "There's no one back there, Felicity. You're just freaking yourself out." But the whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white as panic clawed at my chest. The rational part of me tried to dismiss it, to tell myself it was just my imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Terribly wrong. We were no longer alone in the car. The rusty car was gone, but whatever had been in it, whatever had been following us, was now inside with us, unseen but undeniable. The whispers twisted into words I couldn't understand, a haunting murmur that made my skin crawl. I wanted to scream, to pull over and run, but I was paralyzed with fear, the realization sinking in that the silent passenger was here, and there was no escape. I couldn't take it anymore. My hands shaking uncontrollably, I pulled the car over to the side of the road, the tires kicking up dust as we came to a halt. Sarah and I sat there in the suffocating silence, too terrified to move. My heart pounded in my ears as I forced myself to turn around and look at the back seat, half expecting to see something. Someone there. But it was empty. Yet the cold was unbearable, like the very air had frozen solid. "What do we do?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible, her breath coming out in shaky puffs. Before I could answer, something caught my eye. I turned back to the road, and my blood ran cold. There ahead of us was the old rusty car. It was parked directly in our path, its headlights off, but there was no mistaking it. And in the driver's seat, a ghostly figure sat, its hollow eyes locked on us. For a moment, everything was still. The world seemed to stop, suspended in a nightmare that we couldn't wake from. Then, without thinking, I slammed my foot on the gas, swerving around the car, desperate to get away. But as we sped off into the night, I heard it, a whisper clear and cold right in my ear. "You're not alone." The word sent a jolt of terror through me, a horrifying realization sinking in. The silent passenger was with us, an unseen presence that we could never escape. And as the road stretched on endlessly before us, the terror clung to me, a constant, chilling reminder that we were no longer alone.